Hey guys, we're going to do neural communication this evening. Maybe you can tell that I'm in my basement. My wife and daughter brought home a kitten, and it's really loud and annoying, and it would just sit here and mew the whole time. So I'm downstairs, and they're upstairs for now. But anyways, we are going to get right into this. We're going to try and do two PowerPoints. They both pretty much say the same thing, but the one has some things and that the other one doesn't, and vice versa. So I'm just going to hit new stuff on each one. So this is the slide that we ended with, and I want to make sure that we're fairly clear on how communication happens, because there are questions on the AP exam on the order in which things happen within the neuron. All right, so I'm going to go over it one more time, and know that you'll have an assignment maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, in which you'll have to order everything that happens when communication happens. So, write this down, pay attention to it, pause me, whatever you need to do to make sure we get this. So here we go. I've got a little thing here. I don't have a clock on my screen, so I don't know how long I'm going. Again, I'm going to try and keep these between 15 and 20 minutes long, so this will help. So, all right, sort of reviewing, you've got your message that is coming in and comes in through the dendrites. The message sort of passes into the cell body, and the nucleus decides whether it wants to send it on or not. If it does, it enters into the axon, which is surrounded by the myelin sheath, and then it goes into the axon terminal. And this right here is sort of a blowed up piece of the axon terminal. The neural impulse comes down, hits the terminal button where the synaptic vesicles are located. The electrical pulse comes in and hits the synaptic vesicles, which then rupture. And whatever neurotransmitters, you're going from an electrical signal to a chemical signal when these things rupture. And when the synaptic vesicles rupture, the neurotransmitters, the chemicals, flood into the synaptic cleft. That is the area between the button and the receiving neuron, or the dendrites. Also known here, it's labeled here as a presynaptic membrane. All right, but again, they're not really touching. They're really close, but they're not quite touching. So anyways, the neurotransmitters, this is sort of blown up here, are released out of synaptic vesicles, again, move into the synaptic cleft, and go to a binding site, basically the one that fits it. So dopamine will enter the dopamine site, epinephrine will enter the epinephrine site, and so on and so forth. And when that goes in, again, then there's a decision that's made. These receptors will either fire or not, and then the process starts all over again on into the next cell. So it's just a quick and dirty review of how neural communication happens. Again, an electrical impulse to a chemical message to another electrical impulse. Again, everything psychological is simultaneously biological. All right, so today, you heard me talk a little bit about neurotransmitters, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening, is some different neurotransmitters, that are always on the AP exam. And we are going to use the acronym SNAGGED, SNAGGED, to I guess, to try and remember what these neurotransmitters are, because they are almost always on the AP exam. So the first one I'm going to talk about is known as GABA, G-A-B-A. It's actually this one here, gamma aminobutyric acid. Okay, but we just, for AP Psych purposes, we're going to call it GABA. It is a inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning that it inhibits activity. It stops it. All right, so if that neurotransmitter goes into the receptacle that it fits, if enough of those happen, it actually stops the cell from firing to the next cell, and that essentially stops the message. All right, bad things can happen when these neurotransmitters are not where they're supposed to be, and not in the right amounts. And in some of these, we're going to talk about what happens. You know, if you have an undersupply of GABA, all right, generally you will suffer from things like seizures, tumors, you can't sleep, or insomnia. All those things are things that can happen when you do not have enough of this GABA neurotransmitter. And of course that makes sense. You know, these are all things where you're moving a lot. Okay? Well, if GABA is an inhibitor, it's going to stop those cells from firing, those neurons from firing. So if you have an undersupply, you don't have enough neurotransmitters saying, stop, don't do this anymore. You just are continually going and going. These cells are continually firing, and the result is things like, again, seizures, tremors, and not being able to slow down enough to where you can sleep. So, but that is GABA. And snagged in that acronym, that's going to be one of your G's. This next G is the other G, and it is glutamate. It is an excitatory transmitter. All right, what this does is this gets the cell going. So you get enough of those neurotransmitters flooding into the synaptic cleft, going into those binding sites, and activating that cell. Then the cell is activated, and then this message is sent on down. All right, but glutamate is excitatory. What we found is that it is involved in memory. So you've got a lot of this in the memory part of your brain. When you have too much, people have a tendency to suffer from migraines and seizures. You can also suffer from excitotoxicity, and where if you've got too much glutamate, it will excite the cell so much that it just wears out and it dies. All right. Excitotoxicity literally means to excite a neuron to death. So now there are things called glial cells which can help prevent this, which we'll get to in a little bit. But one of the things, there are some foods that are high in glutamate, and one of those is Chinese food. All right, I don't know if you've ever heard of people hearing or talking about MSGs. You know, no MSGs. A lot of times you'll see advertised, but MSGs is essentially mono something glutamate. Well, what happens is, when you consume extra glutamate, it causes these cells, these neurons, to start firing. And when they fire too much, in this case, these MSGs, people will get MSG headaches. And, you know, if you've ever gone to the Chinese restaurant in Moorhead, or I guess there's one in Maysville. Yeah, I think there's one in Maysville. Either one of those, and maybe you get a headache afterwards, you've consumed probably a lot more MSGs than you probably should have. And that has caused your neurons to fire probably more rapidly than they should have or are used to. And, you know, pain is your body's way of saying, hey, there's something not right. Well, and that's an example of, there's something not right. All right, you heard me mention glial cells. Glial cells are kind of like the glue that sticks the cells together. They also help with communication. These are kind of like the plug-in, or the if you've ever seen a house being built, my basement's not quite finished, but a lot of times you'll have these wire harnesses that will connect to the 2x4s, just to sort of keep everything organized. That's essentially kind of what the glial cells do. They're kind of binding the neurons together, keeping communication free and fresh and quick. And glial cells, we have found that they facilitate some sort of role in intelligence. I don't think we're quite sure what yet, but whenever these glial cells are damaged or too few, the correlation, not causation, but the correlation is intelligence is, I'm not sure what the right word is, hush, affected. We'll just use that word. So, but those are glial cells. All right, and here are the common neurotransmitters and functions. These are things that you will need to know, whether you memorize them, do your cards or anything like that. But these need to be memorized. And there's actually one that's not on here that we're going to talk about. But this is the snagged part. All right, snagged: serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, also known as ACH. The E that's not on here is endorphins. Let's see, we got S and A. We've already done GABA and glutamate. E again is the endorphins, and D is dopamine. All right, I'm going to go through these real quick. If I was you, I would pause them and make sure you write them down, or pause me, so that you can get really, I would probably suggest copying this whole slide down because it's fairly important. And then I'll get the epinephrines that's not on here here in a little bit. So, but first one, we'll go in the snagged order. So the first one on this one I'm going to talk about is serotonin. This thing, it tends to affect mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal, how awake you are. If you have an undersupply, you have a tendency to be depressed, and that's why Prozac and that's how Prozac and other antidepressant drugs work, is that they raise serotonin levels. All right, it's almost like adding serotonin. So that's the S. The N is norepinephrine. That helps control, again, also helps control alertness and arousal, and an undersupply of this, again, can cause you to be in a depressed mood. Acetylcholine, S-N-A-G-G-S-N-A, acetylcholine, ACH. This gets into muscle action, learning, and memory. And this is where you start seeing issues with Alzheimer's. People with Alzheimer's have messed up levels of acetylcholine. Undersupply, you actually lose this as the neurons that produce ACH begin to deteriorate as you get older. And again, this is one of the marks of Alzheimer's disease. And it makes sense, especially with what you know about, if you know anybody with Alzheimer's, they have trouble with memory, learning becomes an issue. So, and again, this is when you have a low amount of this, this is a mark, so to speak, of Alzheimer's. This is one of the things that they test for. The endorphins, I'll talk about it in a minute. We've already talked about the two G's, S-N-A-G-G, the E. Okay, and the last one is D, dopamine. No, I just talked about that. So, anyways, I got confused. It's late, and we have football practice. So, but anyways, we've talked about all of those at this point, except for the E, and I'll talk about it in a minute. So, if go ahead and take some time right now, pause this, and go back through and take a look at these. What does acetylcholine do, and what happens when it's out of balance? Same thing with dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. So I'm not going to pause my talking because you can hit the pause button yourself and kind of go through this. This is a good way to do a quick study session while you're watching. A little more on some of these. Acetylcholine, again, also works with muscle contraction. We've already talked about this. An undersupply of it, you get Alzheimer's. All right, here are the endorphins, the E in the snagged. Endorphins literally means morphine within. And these are natural opiate-like neurotransmitters. And this is linked to pain control and pleasure. Now, I don't know if any of you in class have done cross-country or have run a marathon. In some of my other classes, we do have long-distance runners, and they actually will talk about a runner's high. And it's usually when you get to where, according to them, I'm not, as you can tell, I'm not much of a runner, but it's usually when they are almost to the point where they can't go anymore. And then all of a sudden, the body or the brain releases these endorphins, these natural opiate-like transmitters, opiate as in opium or as in pills. Your body actually makes that. And when people are going through these, if they're going through a marathon, they get to about mile 22 of the 26.2, and they just can't go much further. All of a sudden, your body starts flooding your system with these, and you get literally what's called a runner's high. They get happy, the pain stops, and all of a sudden, boom, they take off. All right, the pain goes away. So, and that's essentially a runner's high. Now, those of you who may be in class tomorrow, if you have experienced something like this, then maybe you can sort of talk about it. It's not really something I've experienced. But maybe some of you who are runners might be able to talk about it. But in opium or heroin addicts, heroin is an opiate. And this really happens to almost all drugs, when you start taking extra of something that the body produces, your body will actually, in order to get to a homeostasis, or in order to get to a good level, will actually stop producing that yourself. So, my body, all our bodies naturally produce endorphins. Well, if I get hooked on pills, heroin or opiates or whatever, all right, my body will actually, in order to get back to normal levels, will stop producing it. Well, what happens when I stop taking the pills? I go from a homeostasis again, or a normal levels. If I've stopped taking them, now I'm short on the endorphins. And literally that's what happens with withdrawals. You have lost those endorphins, and you feel a lot of pain, and it's next to impossible to feel pleasure. And that is essentially what going through a withdrawal is. Now, eventually your body will realize, hey, things are not going well. Let's go ahead and start pumping up the endorphin level again. But it takes time to get there. But that's what happens with opiates, with heroines, and that's why it's so hard for heroin addicts to quit, because literally stopping becomes painful. And it's one of the reasons why you should never do drugs. There, I got that out of my system. Don't do it. It's bad for you, and nothing good can come out of it. So, the N in the snagged, again, norepinephrine. If you get too much of it, you have a tendency to be manic, really, really happy, or really, really high, or go really, really fast. If you don't have enough, it leads to depression. All right, people who have trouble regulating that will suffer from manic depression. And also, you can get bipolar disorder as well, which is an even more, which is a bigger difference between the highs and the lows. So, serotonin, again, is involved in sleep, eating, and your moods. It can also be related to depression. Again, Prozac is an antidepressant. They raise serotonin levels. And here's really how they all kind of work together. I'll let you study that. I'm not going to get a whole lot into this. But you can kind of see, if you are low in serotonin levels, for instance, if this shrinks, that's going to affect mood, anxiety, and it's really going to affect all of these. So it's important that for our bodies, that we stay in relatively good place. So I'm at 21 minutes, so I need to hurry up on this. Dopamine, again, perceptual awareness, being aware of what's going on, and again, muscle control. If you get too much, you get something called schizophrenia. We'll talk at length about this because my brother actually suffers from schizophrenia, and I'll show some different videos of him. So too much, you'll end up with schizophrenia. Too little, you can get what's called Parkinson's disease. Have you ever seen Muhammad Ali? He had the shakes real bad, and at the time they called it punch drunk, but then they found out later it was more Parkinson's. So, and I've got just a few more things. Going back to neurocommunication, so we've talked about, the signal comes in, goes through the neuron and gets, it releases these neurotransmitters. The chemicals that our bodies produce work as, again, they do one of two things. They either excite the next cell to a point where it fires, or it tries to inhibit or stop the cell. All right. Now there are these chemicals, again, are called agonists or antagonists. Chemicals that our bodies produce work as agonists, excite, and antagonists, inhibit. They do this by amplifying or mimicking the sensation of pleasure, if it's an agonist, or blocking the absorption of neurotransmitters, antagonists. And an example of an agonist is opiates that mimic the high that's produced naturally, again, like a runner's high, or the feeling of euphoria when you do something that is great, or if you're a weightlifter, it's getting that extra 5 pounds on your max that you didn't think you could get. All right, a natural high is essentially produced. And those are agonists. All right, and then you have things like botulin, which will block ACH. I think it's supposed to be botulism. And here's how this works when different chemicals sort of mess with your communication. This here is how a neurotransmitter binds to the receptor site on the receiving neuron. So neurotransmitters here, it sent a chemical, and here is the receiving cell. There's a bunch of sites on there. Each neurotransmitter has its own site. Right? Now what can happen is if an agonist can mimic the neurotransmitter. So if this is a serotonin transmitter and this is an agonist, essentially what happens is it is similar enough to this to bind, and it is also similar enough to where it will cause this to fire. Okay? Although it's not the same, it's close enough to where it fires. So, and that is an agonist. Again, it mimics the neurotransmitter, almost does the same thing as the real thing. But an antagonist actually blocks the neurotransmitter. All right? This will fit into the cell somewhat, or fit into the receptor, but it's not close enough to the actual molecule for it to fire. So it decides, I'm not going to fire. But what this also does is this blocks the real one from getting in here. All right. So, and that's two things that can happen with some of these receptor cells. You get the right one and it fires. You get one that sort of fakes out the cell and it fires and it doesn't let the real one in. Or you get one that connects, but it keeps the other one, the real ones, from getting there, and so it doesn't fire. So, and again, we talk about this to show what drugs can do. Drugs can be used to affect communication at the synapse, and that's where we're talking about all this is happening, the synapse level, the synaptic cleft. Again, agonists excite and mimic neurotransmitters, or they can block reuptake. And reuptake is when those neurotransmitters flood the area, whatever doesn't get used gets sucked back in. And again, this happens with drug addicts going through withdrawal. And then again, antagonists will block or stop the signal. An example of that is botulism. Again, that's what I thought. Or Botox. Brain is a little different. There is a blood-brain barrier that blocks out unwanted chemicals, and we'll get into that a little later. So there's that one. I'm only going to spend about 3 or 4 minutes on this one. All right, but this is sort of a good review. This video is probably a little longer than I wanted it to be. 27 minutes. This right here, if you want to, pause this, take a picture of it. This shows, again, the entire process starting, and it's actually numbered. So it starts with the action potential moving along the sending neurons, going into the axon terminals, hitting the synaptic transmission here. It gives you an idea. So if you want to take a look at that, I would suggest it. I do want to talk about reuptake. I had mentioned it. Excess neurotransmitters in the synapse are reabsorbed into the sending neurons through a process of reuptake. And what happens is once this fires, what this does, this keeps it from refiring and refiring and refiring. So once this fires and these are taken in, but these are not. So instead, once it's taken in and it does its thing, if reuptake doesn't occur, these are still going to be floating down through there. So you'll have these random firings of this cell. And so reuptake kind of brings everything back into the synaptic vesicles and the synaptic cleft, and to sort of wait until the next firing to sort of go through that. So I did want to mention reuptake. We've talked about that. Again, here's another example of how you've got different receptors for the different neurotransmitters. Already talked about dopamine. Here's that same chart. This is a very useful chart. Again, if you haven't seen it, you probably should. We talked about how neurotransmitters bind to the receptors, how they really fit in. This is called a lock and key mechanism because, just most time in order to get into a door, you need the right key. And that's what this is. I didn't mention this term, and I don't remember if I put it on your term list, but lock and key mechanism is essentially what what that's called. Talked about agonists, talked about antagonists. Again, the agonists, when you the agonist alone, although it doesn't fit here, it's close enough to where it fires you have full activation of the next cell. When you have both agonist and antagonist sort of fighting to get in, a lot of times you can get some activation, but not all. And then when you have an antagonist that gets in here, but is close enough to fit, but is not close enough to fire, then you have no activation. Here's another example of that. Again, all of these you can sort of pause as you go through. And that's it. We'll get into the nervous system probably tomorrow. So, sorry it was a little longer than I wanted, but we did get a lot of stuff out. And hopefully, again, you are watching this. I told you yesterday, if it gets to the point where we're not watching, then I'll start doing some worksheets that you have to fill out as you do them. So, anyways, hopefully you won't get to do that. Hopefully you'll watch it on your own. Sorry this took a little longer than expected, but it was only 10 minutes longer, and it's still a lot shorter than me having to do this during class. So, y'all have a good night. Peace out.